Hi, everyone. Welcome to class. Today's essential questions are, does anyone find discussions on ethics as interesting as I do? What would it take for you to Revolute? And how much tea can you waste before it becomes a war crime? Let's introduce today's teachers. I am Matt Linton, and I once purchased the Chumbawamba album. I owned that.
Mark of pride or mark of shame?
Shame.
I'm Mr. Rabbers, and I can't do fractions. I own a metric tape measure, and I would much rather do carpentry cuts with metric units than imperial ones, freedom units.
I'm not sure I could really blame you for that one. I'm Mr. Walter, and for an embarrassingly long time, as in until well after I left college, I didn't realize that Tony the Tiger says they're great with a lengthened gur because he's a tiger.
Oh, sure.
That just didn't click.
Sure.
And back for his second episode, because the first one is so wildly popular, is the esteemed Reverend.
Dan Margraf.
That's
me.
You looked confused there.
Yeah. I didn't know if you were finishing my name.
I was going to let you say your own name.
I'm good at that. So last time I was on the pod, I told you about a shameful moment in high school when I made up a source. I have another shameful moment from high school. I'm recalling. I used to sit at this desk. I think it was in biology or something like that. And for some reason, I wrote all of the lyrics to a Led Zeppelin song on like the desk in front of me. The entire thing. It took several days to do. and then sorry, Mr. Wickman. And he found out. It was easy to figure out who had done this. And I didn't get in trouble for it. I'm very grateful for that. Wow. He came over and said, "Did you do this?" Yeah. I wrote the entire lyrics to a Led Zeppelin song.
What song was it?
See, that's what I was trying to think of on the way over here. I think it was Stairway to Heaven.
Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Wickman, I'm sorry.
And despite all of that, we are still the smartest guys in the classroom. Welcome to today's class. All right, on this episode, we are exploring the topic, what is an ethical revolution, the ethics of revolution? And I thought maybe a good place to start in order for us to explore this topic is to define ethics and revolution. As a functioning definition of revolution for this episode, I thought we'd go with the overthrow of a government by non-legal means. I debated whether or not violence needed to be part of it or not, and I decided that I was going to leave it out just in case. But I said non-legal because we operate in a country where we have elections, and you could kind of frame those as a way to replace a government, and I didn't want any kind of that stuff.
It's an interesting definition already, because by definition, one would think that anything illegal may be unethical, but I suppose that's not always the case.
Well, yeah, because there are systems of government that don't even allow for elections or anything like that, and so if it is a tyrannical or Hitler situation, I think.
Well, he was elected, wasn't he?
I know, but then he became a dictator, and
you could have mentioned like anything, like Sudan or something.
Sudan?
You mean
South Sudan?
Oh, Sudan.
Sudan.
The country, Sudan. Not a car. Not a car company with a dictator.
famously used in revolutions, though.
Yes. Yeah, famously.
I'm fine with that definition.
Yeah, you're good at that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then, I mean, ethics, we're just exploring morality, right? That's the morals of action.
So, by your definition, does Gandhi qualify as a revolution?
No, because I would say that's protest that resulted.
But they did change the ruling system of their country, didn't they?
Yeah, but they didn't get to pick it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Strong influence, not maybe revolution.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between a protest that results in change and a revolution, which I think implies more force. I mean, where would you put? Now we're getting in the weeds already.
Right, that's the point of me asking this question.
I think for the purpose of this podcast, we'll go with your definition, and we'll let Mr. Walter come up with other thoughts maybe for a later episode.
My whole theory coming into this is that Mr. Walter has pre-planned revolutions himself already. Maybe carried some out. I don't.
Not that I know of. But is there anything in... That wasn't my phone. Is there anything in Gandhi's protest that is not in your definition? In other words, I'm saying, does your definition need to be more specific because Gandhi's would fit under your definition, but you're not qualifying it as one of them?
I think I used the word overthrow.
Fair. Okay.
Did I say overthrow?
Okay.
Maybe.
I'm just trying to get the definition straight for me.
Yeah. No. And sure. I think there are a lot of wiggle room, and if the purpose of this podcast was to define the term revolution, we could spend a lot of time on
That would be
defining
fun.
that. But
He should have brought the Latin roots.
okay, but this isn't this isn't one of your language episodes. This is
We haven't done a language episode yet. I'm still waiting for the opportunity to do an etymology.
That's our
with
side
the esteemed
podcast.
Reverend.
Yes, that's for the listener. I do teach Latin, and so Mr. Walter was gesturing in my direction.
yes, in this audio only medium.
That's
Once
also
again.
being video recorded today.
It is, but that's for just
Subscribe to the Patreon, and you can unlock the video footage.
We don't have a Patreon.
All right.
Speaking of ethical,
I didn't sign a waiver. Anyway, so let's shift then. Okay, let's say that we have these very loose definitions that obviously plenty of holes could be poked in, but we can't spend all of the time talking about
Shame.
definitions or else. I think people would unsubscribe. That's a real fear I have.
you're worried about losing all those Serbian listeners we have, right? There's 2 of them, last I checked.
Hi, Serbia.
One in Kazakhstan. He's my friend. Hi, Igor.
Hey,
Right?
shout out to Igor.
Send us an email. Let us know more about your life. Let's talk now. Okay, so what is if we have ethics, we have revolution? How would we define and establish parameters for what makes a revolution ethical? And obviously, I thought since we are Christians, we'd start from that worldview, but then follow it up with maybe a chance to explore from other perspectives.
So,
Yes.
did Luther have a good definition for what makes a viable religious revolution? Because there was a war going on between the 2 churches that he kind of started.
For the listener, I'm holding up a book in response to Mr. Walter. It's called the Magdeburg Confession, and I don't need to spend a lot of time getting into it. But is now an appropriate time to maybe talk about a Christian perspective?
Let's
I
talk about
think now would be a great
Christian
time.
perspective.
I think starting with the esteemed Reverend on this topic would be good.
So I'll give you as little background as I can, because this is not a Reformation history podcast.
That'll be another episode.
Yep, that's another
Coming
podcast I'm
soon to the Smartest Guys network of podcasts.
So Luther starts a religious reformation in Germany. There is pushback from the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This results eventually, I'm skipping a lot of history, of course, here, in something called the Schmalkaldic League. Let's all say that. That's a fun word. Schmalkaldic.
Is this related to the Smalcald articles?
Yes.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. The Schmalkaldic League was a defensive alliance of Protestant or Lutheran-minded princes. that formed in response to the possible threat of Charles V invading them militarily because of their religious beliefs. The League doesn't really perform well. They lose. There's a Benedict Arnold involved, a traitor involved, but a story for another time. After the defeat, Emperor Charles makes Lutherans or Protestants sign something called the Augsburg Interim, which is an agreement between Lutherans and Roman Catholics, where the Lutherans have to make a lot of religious concessions and civil concessions, and the Roman Catholics make a few paltry ones, right? But they're arguing from a position of power. Makes sense. Anyway, in response to that, there's one Lutheran city that doesn't sign the interim, that doesn't agree. The city of, and I'm holding up the book again for the listener, I'll show it to the camera, the city of Magdeburg. And these pastors and Lutheran leaders hold up in Magdeburg, they produce what I'm holding up, the Magdeburg Confession, which is a document not only confessing what they believe, that's a lot of it, but also laying out just this question that we're asking. When is revolution against a leader justified? And I suppose you want to know their answer.
Nice clickbait. Thank you. Onward.
On the next episode.
And insert commercial break.
Follow for part 2.
I got some notes in front of me. They lay out kind of 4 steps. And they really frame it this way. It's all about, they call them the magistrates, but this is your government official, your lesser government official versus the superior government official. This is how they frame revolution and whether it's just, or acts of revolution. So their first level is like if your superior official has some natural vices, weaknesses, you don't revolt because of that, right? The second level is there's some, they frame it like atrocious or notorious injury, unjust violence. He, takes away something unjustly, a spouse, a life, leadership, treasure, whatever. Their attitude then is endure it if you can. Don't revolt. Don't push back. So it's a pretty pacifist position. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But then you do start escalating even more. Like they use from Scripture the example of Pharaoh commanding the midwives to kill the Israelite children, right? Well, if you're being forced to sin, if an inferior official and the people he rules are being forced to sin, then resistance is warranted, they say. And that's a little hard to argue against. If somebody's ordering you to kill children and it's unjust, but they're very careful. They say, but you need really true judgment in these cases. This isn't just, I think something's wrong, I'm revolting. I think I'm being ordered to sin. They say, careful and true judgment. Yes.
Quick question.
Yeah.
On the force to sin, they're just being encouraged to disobey and not revolt at this point?
Yeah, that's a good point. Not that they would try to replace the ruler, but they would resist the order of the ruler.
And this is how they frame it. How do you resist? You resist through the lesser official. So what we'd call the governor, or we have various lesser officials, and our superior official, the president. But they recognize that same chain and say your recourse from a Christian perspective is to use those officials who are already in place to resist, right? And then finally, there's a fourth one where, and they use really strong language here. Actually, I have it quoted, I think, where these superior magistrates are persecuting people and lower officials, with, quote, deliberate and persistent attempts to destroy good works for all posterity.
For all posterity.
So they see this as Satan working. They see this as attacks against not only God, and deliberate and persistent is a key word, I think. Mm-hmm. Attacks against God and his people, and finally, the truth about salvation through Christ. Mm-hmm. This is their perspective. If that's happening deliberately and persistently, what other recourse do you have other than resistance, other than what they're doing at the moment, holding themselves up in a city and resisting Emperor Charles V? And what they liken it to is, this is as common sense what we're doing as if your superior official were forcing your wives and daughters into prostitution. What else would you do? We feel we're in the same position.
Yeah.
Amen.
Bold.
Okay, and I'm not saying I fully endorse whatever. I'm just saying this is a Christian perspective, perhaps one among many.
Is this
On revolution.
perspective
Assuredly one among many.
highly accepted in the religious circles that we find ourselves, or is it a often debated stance?
It's a fine question. I think it's relatively unknown, this confession. that
Interesting.
is. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, the principles behind it, I think, are going to be more known in Christendom, where you might break it down maybe not into 4, but into 3 categories. It's simply, okay, don't resist, first of all, if you can avoid it. If you can't, flee. And finally, if there's no other, you can't do either of those, adopt a defensive posture. If that makes sense.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, I have other thoughts, but I've been talking for a while, and I can keep talking. But I have maybe one more thing on this I do want to share, but I'd love to hear maybe your reactions to the men of Magdeburg and what they think. Is there holes in their thinking that you see? I know I gave you a lot of information to ponder.
One of the things that I really appreciate about how you framed it that way is understanding that the system in which you are living influences your response to it. I think that levels of government officials and understanding that you have recourse at different levels to try to work within the existing system before you try to replace that existing system in some larger way makes it adaptable and flexible to a bunch of different scenarios for sure.
Agreed. A reasonable approach, too, where you're actually leaning on government and the government authorities that God has established for a good reason and calling them to account. This is your responsibility to resist evil, no matter what level you rule at.
Can we draw parallels between this and the civil rights protests championed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s?
I would assume there were what we'd call lower officials who were
They're trying to work through.
Work.
They're trying to build court cases to build legal precedents and work through the system.
Or if you read Letter from Birmingham Jail, I'd really recommend that one if you're not familiar, is because in that one, Martin Luther King Jr. is writing to pastors. There were some pastors in the local town who had criticized him for his actions in the town. Not criticized his cause, but the actions he took in defense of his cause. And so what he does is he writes a step-by-step persuasive essay saying, you know, your criticism of me is ignorant because we did not hastily step into this. We tried working through the local authorities. We educated the populace about our nonviolent methods and made sure they were willing to go to jail and bear the consequences of their actions if necessary, and that they were able to do so without retaliating physically, and all these things he lays out this step by step. And it's an interesting read that, I mean, maybe mirrors that a little bit.
Yeah, sounds like it.
One hole that I'm thinking of that might already be plugged. What if there is no lower official, or if, let's say, the corruption runs so deep that the lower official is perfectly in lockstep with the higher official in the government?
I would see that as a whole, too. And I can't speak for these men, but maybe they would say, find another official.
Try to get one in power.
That's where the step flee comes in.
Yeah.
Rather than resist, just move. I guess moving is a lot more difficult in that time period.
Yeah, sure, it would. I mean, it's difficult now. It'd be difficult then, too. And I think, though, let's go back even further. We went back about 500 years. Let's go back further. I think one of the most common responses to government persecution in the church was flee. If you go back to the early persecution history of Christianity, Hide identity or flee, or boldly take the consequences.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking about the book of Daniel. And here we have a minor official, an inferior official, who is
Good example.
disobeying the superior official, but willing to accept the consequences of that if necessary.
And the story being referenced here, if you don't know, is Daniel prayed to the God of Israel. When doing so, was outlawed, and suffered the consequences for it. And he served as a government official. I don't know how much you guys dig into early Christian history, like post what the Bible tells us about too, but that gives us some Christian perspective on whether on revolution and ethical revolution. Just thinking of what the church leaders wrote to the early Christians as they endured an empire in which their religion was technically illegal. Here's some Latin. Religio illicita, an illegal religion. That was its status in the empire. But the church leaders, like I'm thinking Paul, Peter, and then the next generation too, the generation after the apostles, never is the encouragement to resist or fight back. It's simply to endure, or like Paul uses language, run the race until it's finished. And then you'll inherit the prize, right? But that's a Christian perspective, I think a valuable Christian perspective too. Even if the religion is outlawed, the church leadership did not encourage revolution.
Yeah, and I think that's a fascinating perspective too, because when you look at the outcome of that strategy, God blessed it. Like the church grew
because of it.
Because of it.
You know the quote maybe, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Derek glances down.
There's
his
this.
notes. He
There's
sees
this.
something.
Well, I've got all of Bonhoeffer's Wikipedia page printed off.
It's lengthy.
This
Such
is
a valuable resource,
This
Wikipedia.
is Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
We may talk about him today in passing, but that quote is mentioned under the section where it's talking about him being an agent and possibly being involved with the Hitler assassination.
Yeah. And I'm sure he's aware of the context in which it came from those early years in Christianity. And if you don't understand what it means, you guys are the smartest guys in the room, so I know you guys do. But the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, meaning the more the church was persecuted, the more they didn't resist or revolt, the more people were actually intrigued by the religion itself, and it grew the church, the blood being the water for the seed.
Because it's so counter to typical human thought.
Yeah.
It's so different.
It's not what you'd expect.
No.
Yeah.
All right, so I think that have we answered every possible facet of this? I don't think so, but I think we have enough to give us. There's a lot of food for thought there that might influence some of the stuff we say later. Let's say we were approaching this question from a non-Christian perspective, a more worldly perspective. Might that change how we view it?
I think it dramatically changes how you view it, especially in today's, and interestingly, in today's day and age where church and state have become separated to a degree that even if you are Christian, you probably have a secular view on revolution instead of the Christian views on revolution that we've been talking about.
Everybody else is nodding. If you can't see it, but as he speaks,
We're
all
nodding,
nodding.
so you can hear us.
The descriptive audio for this podcast brought to you by the esteemed Reverend Dan Marco.
I'm just very conscious of our listeners. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
We, especially in Murica, where if anything happens that you disagree with, it's like get your guns and your pitchforks out.
Do people still own pitchforks?
I think I do. I don't know why.
Is it a pitchfork or a hay fork?
I have neither pitched nor thrown hay with it. So.
Okay, well, guess
Fork.
it's not.
It's a giant fork
it's a
in my
big
garage.
Fork. Make some spaghetti for it. We are very, and we were just talking about this word, litigious,
yeah.
or is it litigious because of the word litigation? I don't know. I've only read the word.
I think your brother and I both agreed it's litigious.
I think it should be litigious, but I'm
You
a
are
numpty.
welcome to your opinions.
That's for our separate podcast.
Okay. So anytime anything goes wrong or you feel personally attacked in America, which, let's be honest, is all the time, the gut reaction of most Americans is to fight it. And that goes from the little things all the way up to, hey, I don't like who won whatever election, or I don't like whatever is happening in my community. And I think partly because of separation of church and state and everything like that, not just in America, but in our minds, the two have become so separate that we go gut reaction mode as opposed to even thinking about what our worldview should be on it.
Well, and I think we can also add to that just this sense that we've been privileged for a long time and have had a privileged status.
Yeah, we're a bougie society.
And so any inconvenience feels like oppression.
Yeah. This is going to be the stupidest and most first world analogy you've ever heard. But have you ever played a video game where they changed the UI and made it worse to navigate? And it's so frustrating for no reason. It's like it could be like 2 more button presses than normal. But if you have to press that button more than you were used to, suddenly it's an offense to you.
This is oppression.
Yeah.
This is it.
First world problems.
They changed the size on the kicking meter in NCAA football 2025, and I was like, what?
That went right over my head. So now I know how you feel. But I completely agree with you. We are very used to what we have, and because we're so 100 years ago, if we had the treatment that we find oppressive now, we might have thought of it as a blessing from on high.
Okay, so follow-up question then. Let's take that out, because obviously there I agree with what you're saying. There's this it's almost like a reflex. If people took a step back and not just I'm going to be upset, I'm going to yell at someone, but I'm actually going to organize some kind of resistance. What's the level? What's their justification for doing that?
I don't want to cut you off, esteemed Reverend, but I think
Just to clarification, we're talking from a worldly
Yes,
perspective.
yes, that's where
Okay.
we are, worldly
Yep.
perspective.
Go ahead.
I think the closest you can get is Henry David Thoreau.
Okay.
What you take a step back, his On Civil Disobedience, and I wish I had printed out some of that to read, because man, it's hard to read that and disagree with anything that man says. But his On Civil Disobedience is such a good breakdown of secular disobedience, of, hey, these are the things I believe, these are the logical arguments for them, and this is why I am rebelling in the way that I am. And his wasn't necessarily revolution. He was just avoiding taxes in the woods somewhere.
Yeah, but he is the father of what Martin Luther King Jr. did. So we kind of referenced that concept
Right.
already. So he was willing to go to jail for that, but he was not organizing a larger resistance to it. It was more, I have to follow my conscience, and my conscience tells me to do this, and I will face the consequences for following my conscience, as opposed to I'm going to try to overthrow the government.
And I think that's where a lot of the worldly perspective comes from. in terms of my conscience tells me this is right or wrong, and the natural recourse that we have is, okay, let's fight it.
I think there can be pretty well thought out worldly perspectives on revolution, but I don't think most people have given it a well thought out, have thought it out well. I'll rephrase it that way. Because I think for most people, it's a very simple thing. Like, if I can pick some modern issues in America, not taking sides one way or the other, but I think there's probably people who said, if the government would take my guns away, that's enough. That's a justified revolution. Mm-hmm. That's it, right? And you could pick issues on either side, I think, that would be the response. For many, I think that's the perspective on revolution.
But okay, the illustration you used gave me a thought. Does that require a group membership that values that principle to a greater degree? You understand what I'm saying? So, like, again, we're not taking a stand on gun ownership, but this is just an illustration. So, if that as a hobby or as creates a network, and so now if that right is being threatened, there is a built-in network that reinforces my resistance and then creates it.
Yeah, because I could try to overthrow the government because I like the metric system, and like I'm done with these freedom units, these imperial units. But I don't know how many other people I would be able to find willing to overthrow the government over that particular. Now that's kind of absurd, but is that the kind of point? Like you need a specific set of ingredients for this to happen. You need the network of people. You need an issue that's divisive enough and captivating enough to make people maybe even compromise on some of their other morals. Because if you ask them, is killing okay? No. Is killing for this okay? Well, you find yourself in different moral and philosophical views to perpetuate or to substantiate your justification for this revolution.
I think that is easier now than any time in history, because especially first world country, like the news systems are built on, we have news 24 hours a day. You don't have stuff to talk about for 24 hours a day. So what do? You just talk about the same issues over and over, and you blow them up, and you get people riled. That's how you do that. Social media, it is an echo chamber of people getting angry about the same issues. You could probably find a large group of people that would like to switch to the metric units if you really tried on social media, like Twitter or X.
X!
That was so weak. You could find those people, and I'm not saying you would be able to overthrow the entire United States for that, but you could probably enact some local change if you got enough of those people together. And then once you get a local change, that area, what was that magistrate? Is that their official?
The magistrate. We'll use official.
To use the terms we've already done, would be able to influence the officials above them, possibly to some degree, and then you could get greater change working within the system, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure I would call that revolution, but I think there is a network, like we've been talking about, for any issue here, because of the way that we have connected ourselves in the modern world.
You know, this talk of imperial units and metric units has really got me riled up. Can I share something with you, gentlemen?
Please.
I don't think we can stop you.
I wasn't going to take no for an answer. Here we go. Random rant time. Why can't people remember what they said to people? How many times have you been in a conversation where they've told you the story before and they are telling you like they've heard it the first time. I cannot remember the amount of times I've heard people tell a story or an anecdote to me multiple times, and it gets repeated. And in the repeat tellings, they have no recollection of them telling it to me in the first time.
I feel targeted.
You are but one example.
Oh, no.
I have to research to back this up, but I feel this is endemic of people thinking more of themselves and how good they sound versus the actual two-way interaction between yourself and the person or people you are with. We are all human. All our memories are not perfect, but I think many of us could benefit from giving a more concerted effort, remembering not just what we said, but who was actually listening.
Wow.
The answer is no one's listening.
Now, a question. When that happens, Mr. Rappers,
Yeah.
are you one to embrace how powerless you are in that moment and just nod? Or will you stand up and say, "Sir, I have heard this before"?
Sometimes, if I am tired or don't have the effort, I'll just let it be said fully and like just nod along. Sometimes I'll say, "Oh, yeah, I remember this." Or sometimes I'll try to finish it for them. Like, "Oh, did I tell you that before?" Yeah.
I appreciated when you made it moral, when you said, "This is about people thinking about too much about themselves."
I always have to justify it.
Resonated with me. Yeah.
So this is the point where we give it a grade. His rant.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So,
I start.
yeah. Oh, I'm making you start.
I think of myself as a pretty notoriously easy grader, and this is one. Like I said, it resonates with me. This is a B+ for me.
I'm going to give this an A because I feel targeted, and I feel like if I don't give it an A, then I'm even more targeted, or like it's going to be biased or something. So you can take your A and leave.
Mr. Walter is shrinking in his seat.
So what I've learned from this is the secret to getting good grades in Walter's class is intimidation.
Attacking him personally with his own idiosyncrasies.
Did I tell you about the time that... No.
B-.
I feel like that's a high grade. Right? Yeah.
I mean, I do teach all AP stuff, so it's a different grading scale. Let's shift to. Let's look at a specific revolution and try to apply our definition of ethical revolution to a specific revolution. And for the sake of our audience, we'll pick the one that they are probably most familiar with, unless they're from Serbia, and which is the that's Kazakhstan, I think.
That's right.
The American Revolution. And since I'm the history teacher, just to get us all up to speed, I'm going to give the quickest summary of the American Revolution that I can give without feeling inept. So this is what I'm going to say. Okay, so context: American colonies, part of the British Empire. Britain fighting decades of war against France, get super distracted, kind of forget to govern America for a while, ushering in this era called salutary neglect, where there are rules that are on the books, but nobody's enforcing them. The Americans are left to their own devices. They create their own local governments, their own governors, their own elected representatives who are making decisions on behalf of the colonies. In that era is also the Enlightenment. There's this sense that we can logic out the best form of government. John Locke is writing treatises on government's role in protecting life, liberty, and property. The British passed something called the English Bill of Rights, which extends certain rights and privileges to all British citizens. And the Americans are like, we are British. We have all of those rights too. And they're operating under that definition. Then the Americans start the 7 Years' War. And Britain decides this is the last war we're going to fight against France, so we're just going to spend all of our money on that. And the British and the Americans fight side by side against the French. They win. They get all of the territory of the French in the Americas, except for Haiti, because there's a lot of sugar there. And then The Americans are super proud to be British, high-fiving British soldiers that they're fighting side by side. And then the British open up their checkbooks, and they're like, well, that's a scary number. We should probably try to get some of this money back. And how do you get money back? Well, you tax people. And you know what? The Americans really haven't been paying the taxes that they're supposed to be paying, and they kind of started this war. So what if we ask them to help pay for this war that they started and to pay for the troops that are currently stationed there to protect them from the Native Americans? And so let us place a small tax on sugar. And
11 cents, right?
it was pretty small, and it was actually a lowering of the existing tax. But the previous tax was not being enforced, so it felt like a new tax. And that's where it all unravels. And so the colonies begin organizing resistance to this tax because they feel like their rights are not being respected as British citizens. They do not have representation in Parliament, the body that is issuing these taxes. And so this escalates, ultimately culminating in the Boston Tea Party, where they throw millions of dollars of tea into the Boston Harbor, triggering the British to punish them, especially the city of Boston, with the intolerable acts, and then revolution happens.
Question.
Yes.
Did any other British colonies have representation in Parliament?
They did not, and that's part of the problem is, okay, so the Americans felt like since they were born in Britain or descended from the British, that they shouldn't be treated the same. So they had the same legal standing as India and other non-white colonies. But they felt since they were British in language, in culture, in ancestry, that they should have the same rights as, but they were treated as a colony and not as British.
Were they still considered British citizens?
They didn't have the same rights fully. They considered themselves as like that's kind of the debate here, and so this concept of virtual representation throws in there because they go to Parliament and say we have no representation here, and Parliament says yes you do, because every member of Parliament represents every British citizen. Or every part of the British Empire. Maybe I shouldn't have used the word citizen. Every part of the British Empire is represented by Parliament. And so since you are part of the British Empire, we represent you too. And they're like, well, but we don't have a person that we voted for and sent to Parliament, and so it doesn't count. And so there was this linguistic barrier on how do you define representation.
Regarding that,
Linguistic fisticuffs.
that's the name of our podcast.
That would be great.
Anyway, I've heard a take, and maybe briefly you can respond to it, that the higher up politician players in the American colonies wouldn't have actually wanted representation. I know that's what they were crying for, but because the representation would have been able to affect any meaningful change for them, it would have almost been a token representation. Does that sound?
Yeah, I mean that become
right.
how many representatives would they have been allowed to send? So it's a symbolic gesture that if they had gotten it, would it have even prevented anything? I don't know.
But it speaks to a larger feeling they're having.
Yeah.
We want representation.
Yes.
In a meaningful way.
Yes. Yeah. I mean what they probably wanted was the right to create laws for themselves through their local representative bodies instead of their
bit more autonomy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is what they had been used to for decades.
Sure.
While Britain was busy fighting the French in war after war. Personal favorite, the War of Jenkins' Ear.
like EAR?
Yes.
Ear.
Yes. I believe the story goes that a French vessel raided a British vessel. In the process, Jenkins' ear got cut off. And so when they went to the government to plead their case for their mistreatment in the hands of the French, they handed Jenkins, like a little box with Jenkins' ear, like, look what they did to Jenkins.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Persuasive. You hand me an ear, I might start to listen.
Yeah.
Fun.
No.
Great.
Not
Was
much
there
happened.
a point to all this? Sorry.
To what? This discussion of the background of the American Revolution?
Right.
Okay, so yes. This is. I didn't realize I had to be so literal here, Mr. Walter. But
We went on a tangent about different questions and then weren't getting to the point, so I was trying to help segue.
Was it ethical?
Was it Christian or ethical?
Yes.
Ethical.
Say yes. Yeah, I agree. My stance on this, if I can start us off, has always been I have seen nothing that the British did that would justify raising arms against the government. Maybe some of our listeners will not enjoy that perspective. I think to some who grew up in the American educational system, that opinion could be a bit abrasive. But I'm happy to be enlightened by the enlightened gentleman in this room as to why it was a justified revolution.
happen. We've talked about whether or not, from a secular perspective, whether or not it's ethical from the point of view of what is at stake, and is that grievance an ethical grievance? So were the rights that were being withheld from the American people that they wanted representation over and therefore were willing to fight for, were those rights that were being withheld of ethical concern?
See, and this is where I don't know if the right word is cynicism here, but I think one of the reasons why I would characterize the American Revolution as unethical, from my perspective, is that I have a certain sense that this was one of those rich man's wars and a poor man's fight. That the people who were most affected by the tax and most upset by the tax and were writing the rhetoric and laying out the argument for all of this was a rich upper class that was trying to preserve their status and power and not necessarily wanting to extend it to the people who were fighting for it.
To pair alongside that, I do think there were some legitimate grievances.
Yeah, for
Yes.
sure, for sure.
Yep. But not ones that warranted loading your musket.
Now, okay, I'm gonna. I don't know if this is really playing devil's advocate. This is an argument that someone once made to me, who was a historian and a Christian, and what he said was, from his perspective, it was an ethical revolution because the American colonists were choosing which rulers to obey. The argument that he was making was that the people of America were placed between two governing bodies, the British government, Parliament, King, versus the colonial government and Senate representative bodies, and that a rebellion against King was really a loyalty to representatives in the colonies.
That's a hard thing to argue. I'm even from like the Magdeburg point of view, where did I pronounce it right? Where if you take it from that perspective, they are moving through proper channels.
Right.
They are using their lower officials as a line of defense against the higher officials. In that point of view.
And what you'd have to determine then is what the higher officials, what they were asking or demanding or doing, grievous enough to require that sort of response, right? Because those Magdeburg men were very careful about that. You said you need to be very careful in your judgment and when and how you resist.
Right. So that brings us back to what rights were actually being
Violated, right?
Sure, that's a word.
I think you'd have to look at which stage in the revolution are we talking, right? So early on, it's taxes. It's almost exclusively taxes. But that resistance to the taxes escalated the tensions, led to additional potential violation of rights, especially after the Boston Tea Party, where they closed down Boston Harbor, they dissolve representative governments in the colony of Massachusetts and restrict more freedoms in that way. But again, if we had American citizens who did millions of dollars in property damage, we might expect that the government would punish them for that.
I think biblically you'd expect the government to respond to that. In fact, that's part of their divinely sanctioned job, is to bear the sword, not for those who do good, but for those who do evil. Yeah, and as you spoke, what makes this so complicated is that idea of escalation. As these things escalated in the American Revolution, it's almost, you get to a point of no return, where you do, as this man, this historian you referenced said, you have to pick a side, and then that strangely becomes the divinely authorized government for you that you're supposed to honor and respect.
Yeah, and my issue with that argument, or what I've come back to when I've wrestled with it a little bit, is, yeah, but there's a constitution to some degree. Now, the British did not have a constitution in the same sense that the United States has one today. They had a collection of documents that kind of guided the principle at that point. But there's still like a proper chain of command, a system, and so if I'm applying it to our country today, could I choose to obey my governor over Congress if Congress passes a law that is within their powers as ordained by the Constitution? It falls under the federal jurisdiction. If I just don't like it, can I choose to obey my governor instead?
Right.
But
Slightly different way of looking at this. If you were transported to the colonies during this time, let's say after Lexington and Concord, where there is now open fighting, and you are in this situation, you are made to be a colonial citizen of British descent. Just that's how you're going to be identified, however that happens. What do you do as a male that would be probably enlisted or asked to fight, or maybe you're not asked to fight? Do you, there's no out of this. You are just stuck in that time period. Conscientiously, as a Christian, do you choose to fight, to take more of the pacifist approach, to flee?
yeah, well, and that's a good question, because I mean, the other reality is you have groups like the Sons of Liberty, and you can find diary entries about this, who would show up at people's houses and say, "You will join our side, or we will kill all of your animals, burn down your house, and do all this stuff." Right? Like, so it's not just.
I'm going to give him an offer he can't refuse.
I thought it was all just patriotism.
Because there's a lot of dark stuff you have to go against. And, I mean, that's just taking our individual selves. You take into account family, loved ones, house and property. That's another variable to the equation of deciding what you do in this day, in that day and age in the Americas. And
we talk about the influence of news too. I mean, those battles like Lexington and Concord and others, there's controversy about how they even started, whose fault it is that they happened. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that
No,
yeah.
nobody. You won't find anybody who claims to know who shot first.
Yeah. So depending on what you're hearing, they attacked us. Well, now what do I do? Do I have to defend? Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, and maybe that's where we have to say, We are not trying to judge the motives of individual
Appreciate that, yeah.
participants. We're talking about the struggle as a whole and as a concept and as a theoretical, maybe a bit of an abstract thing because of all of the nuance that we just don't have time to get into.
And as people who live far removed from that, we have the luxury of looking back and making these judgment calls, these broader judgment calls. So that's what we're trying to do, right? Mm-hmm. And I think in the end, I still see nothing grievous enough happening to warrant full-scale revolution.
I would second that statement.
I would also agree.
I would like to agree, but let it be known to the listeners that does not mean that everything America has done is bad. Like, there is a lot of great blessings that we enjoy here in this country that would not be around if it weren't for this unethical revolution. So,
well, look, I think it's important to remember that we firmly believe that God can work good through the actions of anyone, whether they are good actions or bad actions. And,
either through or in spite.
And I will be proudly celebrating the 250th birthday of America, in 2026. So, let's end with some closing thoughts.
Sounds good. I'll go first. If the only thing you know or remember about the American Revolution is what you learned in grade school, maybe high school, or maybe college, it might be good for you to reread or to pick up some academic literature on our what?
He's given the homework.
That's not homework.
Suggestion.
Sorry. This is not homework.
This is not homework, no. But it is a suggestion. Because I
suggested reading.
Because I learned a lot just by sitting through and recording this podcast with you gentlemen, because this is not my area of expertise, and learning or hearing Mr. Linton talk about the American Revolution brings up nuances that I've never heard before. And I think it's prudent to remember that you probably have an incomplete picture of history. No one can know everything there is to know about the history of a nation or the world. You will have your blind spots, and that ignorance can maybe get you into trouble when different issues come up. Also, if you've only been fed history from rhetoric of different politicians, you may also have some blind spots or maybe some things that could be debated by academics. Second thing is Christianity should be touching and affecting everything in your life. Every decision you make, everything that you look at should be viewed through a Christian lens. And if you're forgetting that, and we all do, because we aren't perfect, and we all forget because we're going to let other things get in the way, just try to do your best to keep that in the forefront of your mind, because it's when that gets out of our mind, when it goes to the back burner, or when it's completely forgotten either on accident or on purpose. That's where we get ourselves or other people in the most amount of trouble.
Thank you. My closing thoughts. First of all, I want to express thanks that we live in a country where we can address grievances through official means, and we have that option, and we don't have to even think about raising a musket, so to speak. But generally speaking, what is my posture, the Christian posture? I recall what Jesus said when he was asked if you should pay taxes to Caesar. He said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. I think in most cases, that is very doable, to give both honor. Finally, as I am old enough, I would like to announce that I am running for the 2028 presidential election. And my platform is shifting to the metrics.
More homework.
You have my vote. You have my vote.
Yes. All imperial units and those who use them will be drawn and quartered.
Ooh.
Okay.
I've always wanted to see one of those. You have my vote. Are we going to cut their entrails out and burn them while they're still alive?
I'm appointing you to that
Okay.
position.
just part of the process.
Look, I'm a lover, not a fighter. Okay, I just find myself maybe echoing the esteemed reverend here that this is. I'm thankful that this is merely an intellectual exercise that we are engaging in, and that nowhere in my mind am I stockpiling anything in preparation for a potential revolution that I fear that I might have to fight in. I love to talk about it and theorize and think about what might I do or what might I have done. When maybe the simple answer is cower in fear is maybe what I might have done. So
Me as well.
I'm happy to be bold and brave as I speak behind this microphone in my comfortably warm classroom.
I think my biggest takeaway is that this is messy, and it gets messy fast. And everyone has their own definitions, and everyone has their own biases, and no matter what you're looking at, it's not going to be clean cut. But as the comedian once said, I was reading a history book the other day, and good news, the good guys always won. So my homework for you today, aside from voting for this man to be president and reading some academic literature, because apparently everyone's giving homework today. If you don't like academic literature and you prefer fiction, there's a great book called The Fort, which I believe was written by Bernard Cornwell. It's about the last British fort in America in the American Revolution. We did not take it. They simply left after the war was over. So it's the war from the British perspective. And if you read that, you will never have the same view of now his name is gone, Paul Revere. You'll never have the same view of Paul Revere after reading that book. But my homework for you is, with a friend or two or 20, identify one thing that you would be willing, as Mr. Linton would say, to revolute for. And debate among yourselves, are any of those things you came up with actually an ethical revolution?
And if it's imperial units, metric units, give me a message, please.
I
might be planning
guarantee.
something.
I guarantee you will learn a lot about how those other people think.
And with that, class dismissed.